So I'm just going to give primarily a positive case for why I think morality is objective, and then I'll address a little bit of the challenge there at the end, which I think will kind of flow out of what I present. So either we need evaluative terms like good, bad, should, shouldn't, right, wrong, or we don't. It's either or. And if we don't need them, then we should stop using them because they don't serve any purpose. If we do need them, then the reason why we need them is going to shed a lot of light on what their referents are in reality. The reason why we need them, the facts that give rise to our need of them, are going to tie them to reality. Those are the facts to which they refer. So for instance, if I say that murder is wrong, I am using the term wrong there to refer to some fact in reality. What is that fact? And this is where Ayn Rand's, as many of you know, I'm an advocate of Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism. But this is where Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism comes in. And it comes in two ways. First of all, I'm going to discuss a little bit about how she anchored morality in reality by identifying the factual requirements of human life as the standard of moral value. And then I'm going to use what I term the Ayn Rand question, which you're going to hear me use repeatedly in this discussion, I think, and that is, what facts of reality give rise to the need of this term we are using? Either there are facts that support a term and make it necessary for us to communicate ideas, or there are no facts, in which case it's just an arbitrary term, we have no need for it. So why do we need evaluative terms? Why do we need the term value? What does it refer to? Well, Rand identifies the fact that a value, in the way that we use it, just in plain language, means something that you go after, something you act to gain or keep. You value money, you value an education, you value a relationship, an education, or if you're religious, you value God. So you go to church because you're after a relationship with God. So before we even have a standard of morality, value simply means objects that we go after, objects of action. And she says, well, why do things go after objects? Why does anything go after things like that? And she observes that only one kind of thing goes after objects, and that is living beings, right? And this is not just humans, but living beings in general, you know, antelopes, cats, birds, and humans, and also flowers and trees, right? And what do? They go after something. If it's a tree, it burrows its roots into the ground, it turns its leaves toward the sky. If it's an antelope, it goes after its food and it runs away from the lion and so forth. What's going on here? Only living things go after values. Non-living things don't, right? So value, Rand says, is not a primary. It presupposes an answer to the question of value to whom and for what. So this is this contrasts with like A.J. Ayer, more specifically actually with G.E. Moore, who would hold that good is a primary. It's undefinable primary. Rand says it's not an undefinable primary. Good to whom and for what? If something is good, it has to have a being to whom it is good. And then there's got to be a reason why it's good. And Rand says the same about values. So she says only living things go after values. And then she says, well, the to whom is answered by the thing going after the value, right? A bird is going after a worm. The worm is a value to the bird. Why is it going after the bird? What difference does it make if the worm doesn't get the worm? And Rand keeps going, and she says, if we keep looking at reality, at all the living things that go after values, what we see is that the reason they go after values is in order to remain alive. And she arrives at this very fundamental conclusion. There's only one fundamental alternative in the universe, existence or non-existence, and it pertains only to living organisms. A living thing can go out of existence, or its life can go out of existence. When something dies, that's what happens. Its chemical elements remain, but its life is gone. And she identifies that this is the very foundation that gives rise to the possibility of and the need of values. A thing can't go after values unless it's alive. And if it is to remain alive, it must go after values. In identifying this fact, Rand has demonstrated that life is the root, the ultimate foundation of the concept of value and of all evaluative concepts. Why do we need the concept ought or should or shouldn't? What do they refer to? In Rand's view, and I agree with her, they refer to the actions, you ought to do this, refers to an action that you should take if you want to remain in existence. Now, obviously, human beings, well, this may not be obvious because I think Alex disagrees with me on this, but I hold, and Rand holds, that we do have free will, that free will is the capacity to activate your mind or not, to think or not to think. And we need to think in order to live. So we need guidance in how to use our faculty of thinking, our rational faculty, so that we can live. So once she has designed or derived this principle that the factual requirements of human life constitute the standard of moral value. Now, life is the standard for any living thing, but for human beings, because we have free will, moral values are chosen values. If you choose to live, and this is the last thing I'll say on this point, and then I'll address some of your other concerns. If you choose to live, now we do have this choice. You can, as an adult at least, you can choose to go out of existence. You can choose, I don't want to do this anymore. I'm gonna die, or take my own life. But if you choose to live, then after that choice is made, at least in terms of logical hierarchy, after that choice is made, you need the things that will enable you to live. We call those values, and then we call the actions that you take to get values virtues. And this is the way that Rand then starts to build a life-based morality on this standard of value of life that I think she has actually derived inductively, albeit. So this is, and I know that there's some controversy in that, but I think she generalizes correctly, and that the very reason that values can exist and that we need to pursue them is because we are alive. So this is the basic meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is a technical term, just meaning how do we know the meaning of the terms that we're using in ethics? And then normative ethics is what should we do and why? What are the principles? So they're two different sets, but those are just technical terms. But that's basically the beginning of the underpinning for that. Now, there's much more I could say, but I want to pause. As to your concern that there's got to be an ought in here somewhere, Rand makes a really interesting distinction that I think helps with this. The normal way that people have thought about objectivity versus subjectivity has been that subjective means you just made it up, it's just in here, it's just arbitrary. And objective means it's out there somewhere. Like Plato's form of the good, right? That would be out there, or God in the Christian view. It's out there, and so you get the commandments, or you get a revelation. And Rand said this is a false alternative, and it's a really problematic way of thinking about what objective is. So she came up with a trichotomy, and she said there is the subjective, which is just sort of going by whims or whatever you feel like doing. There's the intrinsic, which is the term she uses for the idea that the good is out there, detached from human beings, detached from our cognitive needs and from our needs at all. And it just sort of imprints on us, and then we have to do it, God's commandments or something like that. And she says the proper way to use the concept of objective is that the objective is the connection between the mind in here and a fact out there. And in this case, what she's saying is we are recognizing the fact that it is only life that makes the concept of values possible or necessary. And then she makes this final point: to use evaluative terms detached from life is to commit a fallacy that she called the concept of the fallacy of the stolen concept. It is to tear evaluative terms away from the very base that gives them meaning and ties them to reality. So it's a conceptual fallacy as against a logical fallacy. It's an abuse of a concept. And I think this is really enlightening. It is for me. It's like, yeah, if life really is the base and the root of all of this, and you tear the concept of value or should away from it, and then use that with utter disregard to its roots, you have stolen that concept away from there. So anyway, this is just a primer on the reason I think it is. So the ought in this room is the recognition of the fact that given our nature, we have to act in certain ways in order to live. And if we don't act successfully in those ways, we can't live.
Sure. If that's the basis of ethics, there are lots of questions I want to ask about different things you said there, but I suppose a place to start to sort of throw.
All right. We should actually, I suppose, for parody, stop here before we get to his question. Yeah, I don't know. What can you say about that?
I did think the end was funny, where he basically is just like, oh, and if you have a different view, you're just going to be engaged in a rejecting my position fallacy.
Exactly.
Like the whole opening statement was very strange. Like the ought to do X just refers to an action you should take if you want to remain in existence thing is strange. Like clearly there are lots of cases we could imagine where the right thing to do does not keep you in existence, you know? Like if you have to like press a button and it'll like cause your own death, but also like save the universe from being completely annihilated, presumably you should push it, even though it's not conducive to keeping yourself in existence. Just for one example. Yeah, there's lots of weird problems with what you said.
Yeah. I mean, or even like more grounded. I mean, like in Hume's essay on suicide, you know, one of his examples is like a spy who's captured. And, you know, so they kill, you know, so it's like, surely they're killing themselves to, you know, I mean, I don't know. He doesn't explain how they're killing themselves, but I always think like the, you know, biting down in the cyanide capsule or whatever, right? Like, you know, so that they don't get tortured is at least assuming that they're a spy and they, you know, they don't reveal all the information under torture seems morally admirable, you know, at least assuming they're a spy in a good cause.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm still trying to figure out the view because I feel like, you know, I was kind of hearing stuff like vitalism in there, like in the sense that it's like, okay, so there's this, you know, like living things are the things that are going after other things. And like, then he like started talking about free will. And like, I wasn't really sure why that was relevant. I was a little bit confused about that because I guess I was thinking to myself, like, even if you don't have free will, like, but if the thing that's grounding this moral view is like the fact that these living things have these desires to go after things, and that makes, but then like I guess I don't know why free will needs to be part of that equation. Like you could just say like, yeah, you're gonna, I mean, maybe in order to call it morality you need free will, I guess, because like you could make choices otherwise, but I don't know. That was confusing to me. Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah,
I mean, where to start.
You know, usually the word, like the connection people draw between free will and morality is that, you know, if you don't have free will, nobody's like morally blameworthy for doing the wrong thing. But it's a lot more unusual to say that if you don't have free will, then like the actual moral evaluation of your action can't, you know, doesn't make sense, right? Like in other words, you know, it's on the face of it, like it seems like if you don't have free will, then it might not be your fault that you did the wrong thing. But I mean, that doesn't, you know, there's a, you know, that doesn't by itself necessarily mean you didn't do the wrong thing, right?
Yeah,
like,
right.
You know, I don't know. I mean, all this stuff about, you know, living like, oh, there's like no point to worrying about morality if you're not going to be alive, which like, okay, one, I think Ethan's point about that is pretty decisive by itself, but like two, like you could like tell the same sort of story in all sorts of different directions, right? You know, you could say like, well, there's no point to worrying about morality if there aren't any other people around to be impacted, by your actions. Clearly, morality is only going to come up, when there are other people around. Therefore, we should all be pure altruists, right? The opposite of Ayn Rand, right? We should only care about, what's, how our actions are going to impact other people and not at all about themselves, right? Not at all about ourselves. And I think that'd be a terrible argument, but I don't know why it'd be any worse than the one that he just gave, right? Which is, he's just like picking, it's like, yeah, it's like a thing that's like, okay, sure, you have to be alive, right? That's, it's like, oh, well, I guess there's no point in worrying about morality if you don't have any short-term memory, because, whatever moral principles you come up with, you're not going to apply in the future because, you won't remember what you came up with. Therefore, morality is all about memory and, like in some sort of, view out of that, right? I mean, like that just seems sort of equally silly to me. But I guess what really strikes me about this, it's like, I don't know, I did a debate. I remember it was when my ex-wife and I were still in Michigan during COVID, so it must have been at least a few years ago. But I did a debate with one of these guys back in, so it must have been 2020 or 2021. And like, I don't know, I've seen some other, like, I did two back then, right? Because I also did the Yaron Hazoni, right? And I've watched a couple of of his other debates, and there was that other guy I did, so it's like, I don't know, I've seen these guys in action a bunch of times. It just really strikes me that they never seem to like come up with their own arguments for the view. They always seem to recite Ayn Rand's arguments for it, and that seems really telling, right? I mean, it's like, like there's a reason, like serious positions you should be able to argue for in any number of different ways. I mean, like, utilitarians don't all just like memorize John Stuart Mill's arguments and like recite them, on command, right? I mean, they come up with novel arguments for utilitarianism. Like that seems like at least kind of a red flag about a position. If, either about the position itself that's got so little going for it that you can't come up with them, or maybe just a red flag about the group arguing for it, that they're all a bit
sounds
too
more
much
like preaching.
Yeah, exactly.
Sounds more like preaching than talking about an actual view, right? He was like, and it's true, he kept name dropping. It's like, because Ayn Rand said this and Ayn Rand said that, and it's like, yeah, no, that's a good observation.
Yeah, it's like it just seems like I mean, it kind of makes sense. I feel like Ayn Rand's philosophy is kind of like if you like haven't read like any other philosophy and you have sort of like initially libertarian like political inclinations, like you might read Ayn Rand and be like, yeah, that sounds right, and then just kind of like go on like parroting it. But like usually like the kinds of people who do this aren't very like familiar with like other views one might take or like criticisms that one might have. I also just wanted to flag, there was a point at which you said free will is having the like ability to think, which is weird. I don't like know any philosopher who would take that view. It sounds maybe like a sort of like badly like reproduced kind of gesturing and the intuition of like a sort of reasons responsiveness type of view. But like, yeah, free will as the ability to think is definitely not a satisfactory account.
And it's funny too, because I think, right, the Ayn Rand people are all going to be, they'll also, of course, be libertarians about politics, but like libertarians in the sense that people use that word in the free will debate, right? We wouldn't have free will if determinism is true, but it's not true and we do. And I mean, man, you're a super compatibilist if you think that like free will is just the ability to think. I mean, that's like it's like not even an interesting discussion at that point. Do we have free will? Yeah, looks like it. All right, moving on, right?
Yeah. And also it obviously entails that like animals will have free will, presumably like 3-year-olds will have free will. Like there are clearly degrees of thinking that are too rudimentary for it to be constitutive of like agency.
Yeah, but, exactly. Like it's like you know, this is, you're setting the bar so low that it's like, not only can we have free will if determinism is true, but, you know, but all sorts of creatures that nobody normally takes to have free will have it. So yeah, that seems very, very off. And yeah, I mean, I love your point about the disagreeing with my position fallacy, and like, well, because it's like, look, you could so easily imagine like a divine command ethicist being like, oh, you know, people who want to use moral terms, even though they're ripping it out of the context of talking about God, or just doing the stolen whatever misapplied concept fallacy, right? You know, it's like it's so obviously, you know, certainly question begging if you take it as some kind of argument for the view. And I don't know. I mean, I was just thinking like, okay, so earlier when we were talking about emotivism, you know, Ethan, who somehow knows way more about this stuff than I think I did as like a second or third year graduate student, but whatever. So, you know, but Ethan said, yeah, these seem like a problem for, you know, for emotivism if, you know, part of what you're trying to do is make sense of ordinary moral practice. And it's like, I was thinking about that turn of phrase, because it's like, yeah, look, if you're just considering it, like you're not doing this whole weird route about choosing life and, you know, here's exactly how I want to define every concept, and, you know, just reciting Ayn Rand's argumentative moves. Like, you know, I think Tom from Yakubi was making this joke, like, you know, the old, like if you've ever watched the movie Malcolm X, right? You know, like the early parts of the movie before he breaks from Elijah Muhammad, like every time he says something, he says, as the Honorable Elijah Muhammad teaches us, right? Yeah, like if you're not going to do that, if you're just be like, hey, here's a view about what morality is, let's consider it and think about whether it seems plausible. Man, one of the first things you're going to notice right out the gate is that, like, it sure seems like we have moral obligations to other people for their own sake, which, like, that seems to be one of the least controversial things about morality, and it contradicts that. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, like, that's, you know, maybe that's why they all, maybe that's why they all just recite Ayn Rand instead of making a new argument.
Yeah, and not only is there this problem where it's like, you know, clearly there's cases where you can cause your own death, and that also the action is the morally right one because it like benefits other people to a sufficient degree, or it's for like a noble enough cause. But also it's like, I would wonder, like, would this guy want to say that, like, if I get like diagnosed with like terminal lung cancer and I have like a week to live, can I just like go all out, just like do whatever I want, and all of it's morally permissible because there's nothing I can do that's going to keep me in existence or like bring about my own demise any sooner, you know?
Yeah. That is a very good question. All right, let's keep going.
A dart, as it were. If ethics requires the prospect of living and dying, that is to say that were you not a living being who could choose certain courses of action which would cause you to die, ethics cannot exist, if I understand you correctly?
Yes, she actually said that explicitly, that ethics applies, well, values apply only to living things, and ethics apply only to volitional living things.
Then I'd like you to imagine for a second an immortality pill that is just discovered, invented by scientists, and perhaps to avoid some kind of overpopulation crisis, everybody sterilized at the discovery of this miraculous wonder drug. And at least some people take it, and they'll now live forever. And forget for a moment the sort of physical restrictions on this, the heat death of the universe. There's probably some way to imagine avoiding this inevitability. These people live forever. They're not going to die. Perhaps they're transported to some afterlife where they get to live forever in the New Jerusalem. Does ethics cease to exist? Does it no longer matter how I treat my fellow creature because the prospect of life and death is no longer on the table? That seems highly implausible to me.
Yeah, so a couple things. First of all, believe it or not, Ayn Rand uses the very example you're bringing up in her essay, The Objectivist Ethics. She says, suppose there's an immortal robot.
But the robot makes it...
yeah, I guess it's not identical. So people still can die?
Yep. Okay. No, sorry. People can't die, but they're still people. This is the thing. Ayn Rand's robot is this sort of non-volitional, sort of material thing that just sort of exists. And that thing doesn't have ethics. And I think that everybody would agree quite intuitively that if something is dead, this table, it can't have ethics. It of course doesn't follow that if something is not dead, it can. What I'm looking for is, well, I suppose evidence of that is actually a separate thing. I'm just granting for a moment that that's the case, that ethics does rely on life and the prospect of courses of action that will lead to your death, and saying, take Ayn Rand's immortal robot, but turn it into an immortal person who still has free will, even though you're right, I don't believe in it, but again, I'll just grant it for the sake of this, can still suffer, still cares, still has emotions. If we were suddenly immortal and I were causing somebody that you cared about to suffer in front of me, and you told me to stop, I'd say, well, your moral import is gone because none of us can die anymore. So the suffering that they're experiencing can't be called immoral. It might emotively matter to you, but then, of course, if you wanted to start using that as any kind of moral prescription, you'd be jumping over to my side of the fence. So, where does this ethical force that I think most people in this room probably intuitively would still feel in that immortal situation come from?
Yeah, good question. Anytime there is a constructed experiment like this that is outside the realm of possibility as we know it, right? So the ring of Gyges, sometimes people bring it up. What if you had the ring of Gyges? Wouldn't you go around and rape and kill people then? And I always say, well, look, what's the purpose of this mind experiment when we're trying to figure out ethics for where we are here in this world living the way that we are? So the first thing I would say to this request
classic
is that
move, classic.
Not a lot hangs on it, if anything hangs on it, because no matter how I answer it, we still are not immortal, and we have to figure out how to live as human beings. Ethics is a practical subject. It's something that we need because we have to make life and death decisions, and decisions that are going to help us or harm us in life, how to set up relationships, businesses, societies, and all of that. So when we go to a wonderland of sorts and say, well, suppose that's not the case, but this other thing is the case, what would you do then? We're now really not dealing with ethics anymore. We're simply dealing with a different situation. Now, that said, I'll answer the question this way. If human beings could both be immortal, there's no way they could die, and yet they still have feelings and desires and can experience pain and joy, I think that ethics would still exist. It would just exist in a very different way than it does now. The right and wrong would not be about keeping you alive. It would be about making life simply the very best it could be, which, by the way, ethics is about now too, because living, the point of according to the objectivist ethics, the point of ethics is not just to keep you alive, it's to keep you alive and enable you to flourish, to live to the fullest extent that you can, given your potentials, to really enjoy this one and only life that you have.
What would be that standard of
if you were to take away the
if you take away the death,
if you take away the death element, then I guess you'd just be able to enjoy things forever and just never have that stop.
So it would become like a hedonistic theory of ethics. It would become about maximizing pleasure.
It would become about maximizing flourishing.
Okay.
So you would, instead of living just, in a mundane way, you would want to live in the richest way possible. But I wouldn't call it hedonism, because I don't think that mere pleasure is what makes human life interesting.
Sure. Well, whatever we want to call it, it seems to me, therefore, that if you can have a concept of flourishing and value, and indeed ethics, even if it's ethics of a different kind, without life and death, then I suppose I would look with suspicion upon your earlier supposition.
Yeah,
that
life would no longer
requires.
Life couldn't be if you can't die, life can't be the standard of value. But that's why I oppose. That's why I oppose the.
Suppose, for example, and I understand. I mean, a lot of people have this reticence to engage in thought experiments, and I understand it because they seem sort of wishy-washy and a bit out there. But they're tools in the way that, like, you might have a really, really long, convoluted mathematical syllogism, which seems to be super impractical and totally weird, but somehow whatever it juts out at the end gives you some kind of practical wisdom. So, but if you prefer, if you want a more imaginable, conceivable example, then suppose instead of living forever, everybody is immortal up to a point, and everybody knows their death date. Like everybody on their 25th birthday, it gets killed, and they know there's no way to avoid it for whatever reason. They know the time, the place, the date that they're going to die 100%, and they know they can't die before, and they know they're not going to live any longer. This doesn't require this sort of strange vision of immortality and sort of universal conquest and avoiding the heat death. It seems to me that as long as it is even possible to say that there is such a thing as value and ethics in either of those situations, we cannot say that in principle ethics is about life.
So this is where I absolutely disagree, because you are taking fanciful, thought experiments that do not happen, and as far as we know, cannot happen. Mm-hmm. So you're treating a metaphysical impossibility as the environment within which we need to investigate ethics.
Well, suppose you would
I
say...
think, well, let me just finish this thought, though, because I really think that's the wrong way to go about it. So I want to give you a hypothetical.
Sure.
Suppose we lived in this world,
mm-hmm.
and suppose human beings were mortal, and suppose that they could either live beautiful, happy lives if they acted in certain ways, or miserable lives if they acted in other ways, or simply die if they didn't succeed in achieving their values. And there was a moral code that said the right way to live is in a way that enables you to live a beautiful, flourishing life in harmony with other people, leaving each other free to do their own thing so we can trade with each other and all of that. So you were given that alternative or any other alternative in this same world. Mm-hmm. You were given another alternative of, well, people should be forced to do things against their will, or people should suffer as much as possible, or anything like that. Which of those alternatives would you choose?
The first.
Yeah, see, if we're here in this world thinking about the real facts that are before
mm-hmm.
us, and when we're, there are a bunch of young people here from all over the world, and what they need to know is, how am I supposed to act in this life? They're not right. jonesing for, how am I supposed to act in those made-up worlds?
Yeah, I mean,
those made-up stuff is fun. Harry Potter is fun, but it's not the thing we need to focus on.
Those made-up worlds are, of course, supposed to be used as a tool to investigate the definition of terms.
Yeah.
But it's sort of like imagining if you were to say that your shirt was part of your body, an intrinsic part of your body, and I said, well, can you imagine a situation in which you didn't have your shirt on? And you say yes. Even though that world doesn't exist, it helps us to make a point in the real world that your shirt is not identical with your body. And similarly, if you say that ethics is identical to, well, I shouldn't say identical, but is intrinsically reliant upon the concept of death, then we construct another imaginary world where we separate them out. And we say that, well, here's a world in which ethics exists, but death does not. I think that shows that in principle, it can't be about life and death. But also, I mean, you asked me which of those worlds I'd prefer. But that's just it. It's a preference. I mean, if I could live my life in fear every day for the rest of my life, or live my life in pleasure for the rest of my life, I'd pick the latter, not because I think there's some objective rule of the universe that somehow gives me a prescription to do so, but just because I prefer it, because it's an emotionally preferable state for me. And that's how I approach that kind of dichotomy as well. That's why I would prefer to live in that world. And I suppose what I'd want to ask you in return as well is that, there are so many things. I mean, for example, I want to know how your egoistic ethic, your rational egoism that you derive from objectivism and Ayn Rand, that the rational thing to do, and indeed the ethical thing to do, therefore the thing you're mandated to do, is whatever's going to help your survival as a creature. I want to know where something intuitively unethical like torturing an animal comes into this. Because when I say, well, why should I care about somebody else? It's very easy to say, well, my survival prospects are actually much increased by living in a society where we treat each other nicely, where we have a social safety net, this kind of stuff. Fine. But if somebody tortures a dog, burns them alive on a fire or something because of the pleasure that they receive from doing so, I can't see any way for an objectivist of this brand to say that what they're doing is wrong. It in no way upsets their own survival. It in no way makes them closer to death. In fact, the sort of hedonistic release that they get from it may indeed bolster their life and make it more worth living, and possibly even go on for longer for that reason. So how does your worldview capture the intuitive immorality of something like animal abuse?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't think it's an intuitive issue. I think it's just a matter of fact that it is profoundly immoral to torture an animal for no good reason. So, I mean, I'm not against eating animals. I am against unnecessarily putting any animal through pain.
Sure.
And the reason is for the same reason that I hold life as the standard of value for human beings. Life as the standard of value is broader than just for human beings. Life is the standard of value for a flower, let alone a dog. I think it's wrong to just kick a beautiful flower. So I don't think it's immoral on the order that if you do that, you should be, or certainly it shouldn't be illegal to do that. But I don't think it's even immoral on the grounds that if you see somebody do that, you would hold them in contempt for the rest of your life. If I saw somebody torturing a dog, I would hold the person in contempt for the rest of my life. But let's stick with the flower because I want to take this to an extreme.
Yep.
A flower is a beautiful thing. It's alive. It would be absolutely nihilistic to kick a flower dead just for the hell of kicking a flower dead. It's like hatred of the good for being good. It's hatred of life for being alive. So
blaspheming the Holy Spirit.
Yeah. And so there's a real richness and depth to this idea that life is the standard of value because it is broader than just human life as the standard of moral value. It means that that life is profoundly unique and important because it is the thing to which values pertain. It's the only thing to which values pertain.
And that sounds very attractive, but for your ideas here or your worldview to be objective, you'd need to say that to the nihilist who says, I just don't care. I just want to pick that flower. I honestly, I just don't recognize what you're talking about. You have to tell them that they are wrong and presumably in a way that you could describe to them. So a moment ago when we were talking about life and death being intrinsic to ethics, there's an important distinction to make. There can be the life and death of the person doing the action or the life and the death of the thing that's being acted upon. So it seemed like a moment ago you were saying that my ability to live and die is a requirement for my ability to be moral in my interactions with other people. But if a flower, though it can live and die, is not a moral agent. A flower is not the kind of thing that can have a moral course of action. Maybe that's because it doesn't have free will. Maybe also that's because it doesn't have emotions. Right? I'm saying both of these can be explained on our worldviews equally. But when you say that it's wrong for me to kick that flower, if I'm going to be a rational egoist, which means that for me personally, my life is what matters, my survival prospects, me alone, and even other human beings, their survival prospects only matter insofar.
May I just correct one thing there, because I don't want you to go on with a mistake.
I want to make sure I'm getting you right.
So, egoism does not hold that your life and your life alone matters to you. It means that your life is your primary concern. A human life consists of all sorts of relationships that are extremely important to you.
Yeah, but so they're important to you.
Yes.
So that their value again is.
Yeah, but they are important.
They're important, but they're only important insofar as they serve me.
They're important to you. There's direct importance, and then there's all sorts of indirect importance. So, for instance, there are people in China right now or in India right now who I don't know, and you don't know. We don't know anything about what they're doing. But if they come to my mind, as they just have, because I've brought them up, do I wish them well? Yes, because they might be the person who invents the next thing that's just awesome for human life, right?
All right. I wanted to, obviously in this back and forth, there's no super clear stopping point, but I did want to go a while just to kind of keep us on track for time tonight. But we've been through a lot of material. I'm not at all sorry that we're watching this debate. I'm definitely enjoying myself, but it is a little bit funny, right? Because they're trying to have this debate about meta ethics, where on some level the topic is the advertised one. Is there such a thing as objective morality or not, right? Or is or should you think that there are no moral facts, and in fact we're not even trying to describe facts, and be an emotivist, but they're also doing it. Like they're also sort of debating these incredibly weird non-standard views about normative ethics, about like the substance of what's right or wrong that Ayn Rand cultists have, right? So it's a really weird combination, but we've gone through a lot of material in the last little while. If you guys want to jump in.
I mean, it's kind of hard to even know where to start. I mean, I did think it was funny, like I said in the chat, that the guy was like, I don't like unrealistic hypotheticals. And Alex was like, okay, immortality was too bad. Okay, well, how about one where we're immortal, but like we're going to die, but we actually know our death dates in advance? It's like, I don't think that's going to really assuage the concern.
Well, it's so funny, right? Because for what he's trying to do, he could have done what you did earlier and just said, oh, how about a doctor has just told you have like 6 weeks to live, right? But like instead, he goes through this incredibly fanciful, right? Like Logan's Run kind of hypothetical. It's like, don't, I mean, it's fine. I have no problem whatsoever with like considering that and drawing conclusions from it and all that stuff. But it's like, don't start the sentence with like, you know, if you want something more grounded.
He's being like almost a parody of like an analytic philosopher with like thought experiments. And
it's like, oh, you thought that was unrealistic? Well, okay, we can take out the heat death part, okay? Because clearly that was the only the only issue.
Yeah, all right. It was unrealistic because it violated the laws of physics. Fair enough. All right. So we're in this Logan's Run world. It's just, you know, again, I'm on his side of the thought experiment thing, totally, right? But it's just like, this is just, it is just such a parody of somebody who like refuses to move away from that he's like offers to, and then does that.
Yeah.
I mean, it was really hard not to pause when they first started talking about thought experiments, though, because Biddle, the objectivist, does like he just does. I mean, he has a very smooth and confident speaking style, but he just does what like the dumbest intro to philosophy student does. And it's like, oh, but that's not realistic. So why are we talking about it? Right. Like, it's like, no, that, you know, we're trying to figure out what we even mean by these terms. We're trying to figure out, you know, what principles are plausible. Right. So yeah, you're considering, like, if I say that, you know, part of what it means to be a moral agent, you know, is to be a member of the human species, right? Then it's like, yeah, it could be that all the moral agents that we've ever run into are members of the human species. But like, it does seem pretty relevant to say, okay, so just to be clear, if like, you know, aliens who had thoughts and feelings were real, right? Then they wouldn't count, right? Like that seems relevant to me. I mean, it's like, you know, or I don't know, if we imagine that like all of the non-English speakers in the world died, right? So it would currently be the case that all moral agents were English speakers. Like, but it's like, okay, wait, you know, but if that's part of your theory of what it is to be a moral agent, then the possibility that there might one day, you know, be people who spoke other languages, like, does seem pretty relevant to me. And by the way, I should say, I know this is not necessarily a super popular view in chat, since I think a lot of people who think themselves as very grounded materialists who are influenced by certain kinds of online left discourse think that like thought experiments are terrible. But it's like, man, read Capital sometime. You'd be amazed at how many unrealistic hypotheticals Marx uses in his arguments, right? Like, and often like flagging the unrealisticness, right? You know, that's like, I know this isn't the case, but just for the sake of analytic clarity, let's imagine that everything is sold at its value. You know, let's spend 3 chapters imagining that every single person in the society is a small producer, you know, like all of that stuff. And he's right to do so, right? I mean, it's like, yes, this is clearly a useful tool for reasoning that, you know, if in all the cases we're familiar with, 2 things coincide, but we're still trying to figure out which is the one we actually care about, then considering a case where, you know, that like, if we can have a consistently describable scenario where the 2 come apart, then considering it does seem to be pretty relevant. And, you know, it's funny too, because like the one that Alex started them with, it's like, look, the Biddle started the discussion by sort of, you know, saying, hey, I know you're used to, you know, arguing with religious people, but here we are, atheists together, you know, a little bonhomie about that. And it's like, look, here's a moral intuition that like I've never met an atheist who didn't have, that it would be morally hideous to torment people in hell forever,
Hmm.
right? That would be like morally indefensible, right? That's, you know, again, you know, if there's an atheist who doesn't agree with that, I haven't met them. Okay, hey, now we have ethics in a scenario where death is off the table, and you know, and like, if you would think that that was moral, that like that's it's immoral to cause, you know, to cause somebody an eternity of pain, right? Clearly death isn't an option here. Then like, you clearly don't really believe on reflection that morality only stems from the decision to remain alive when that's off the table, right? And like, in fact, this is the kind of thing like a utilitarian would say that like, oh, you know, clearly on reflection, we don't really care about life as the primary value, right? We clearly care about happiness. We care about life insofar as, you know, as you know, we care about life because we care about happiness, and you can't have happiness without life. But I mean, the primary thing we care about is happiness. And it's like, that just seems like the kind of argument that Biddle is rejecting on the most annoying intro to philosophy student grounds, that, you know, that it's like, oh, well, that's just silly because that's unrealistic. So why am I considering it?
But didn't he, to his credit, didn't he kind of try to attempt to answer it? Like, I mean, I don't know how good his answer was, but I did note that like, he went on the tirade, and I was really worried, and I saw you reacting, Ben, and I was like, oh my God, he's going to do that really annoying thing where he's going to refuse. But it seemed like he tried to engage with it afterwards. Nevertheless, did he not?
I mean, he did, but he did in a weird way. Like he, you know, like first he was like, well, this is just irrelevant. Yeah. And then he was like, oh, well, I guess if we're going to, you know, play this game, then I guess morality would be about something other than life. But then he just sort of never, like, he never seemed to make the connection that if it's true that there would be morality, right? That like, that would be morally wrong in the sense of what I mean by moral in the actual case, then therefore what I mean by morality in the actual case cannot in fact ultimately be about, you know, the decision to remain alive, right? That can't be the fundamental thing, right? Like he sort of said, like, he sort of treated it like, if you said, yeah, 2 + 3 = 5, but you know, what if it wasn't? And, you know, and like somebody who's going to be very indulgent about going along with that, right? You know, that it's like, okay, I guess if I'm, you know, reconsidering this, then, you know, like, but it's like, no, the question isn't like, what if something incoherent were true? Or, you know, like, it's like, the question is, what does this say about what we mean by morality in the actual case? And it seems like he, you know, I mean, so it seems like he never actually got around, like, engage with that, or sort of acknowledge that there was a thing there that he needed to engage with.
Yeah, it's it's kind of funny, like an example that I always thought was sort of funny to use on people is like, you know, if you say like, oh, well, this hypothetical is unrealistic or it's fanciful, so I don't have to engage. It's like, okay, like if we imagine that like the sky was purple and like all of the clouds were shaped like elephants, like that's very unrealistic and fanciful. But like if I had a friend who was like, oh, if the sky were purple and clouds were shaped like elephants, I would just start torturing babies for fun. Like surely you would be like, oh, that's indicative of like a serious moral failing, you know?
Yeah. I mean, exactly, right? It's like, look, there can be thought experiments that are flawed because you know, they're like, it could be that you just haven't succeeded in just laying out an internally coherent scenario. It could be that it's not well described enough for it to be you know, for it to even be clear whether it's internally coherent, or it's not well described enough for, you know, anybody to sort of have a meaningful intuitive reaction to it, right? Because you just, you know, because it's you know, it's unclear, right? You know, what you know, like what principles would even operate, or all that is true, right? Like the point is not just like anytime somebody says here's a thought experiment, right, then, you know, you have an obligation to be like, okay, well, you know, here's what I think, right? Like it could be that one of the things I just said is true. It could be that like it's just, you know, just don't have a clear intuition about it, that's fine, right? I mean, that's like that, you know, that happens all the time, right? You know, it's like, okay, I'm being asked something kind of novel, and it's, you know, and it doesn't even seem worth my time to like try to figure out what I think, because it's sort of, you just haven't, you know, it doesn't evoke anything much one way or the other, right? But like my problem with this is he clearly does have a moral reaction to the hypothetical, which is that it's like, yeah, he obviously thinks that would be very wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And he's kind of acting as if, okay, now we're considering this, you know, we're imagining that up is down, and, you know, and we're trying to like figure out like how to use height concepts, and maybe there'd be this thing that's sort of analogous to height or whatever in this world. It's like, no, what this shows is that like what you actually on reflection think is moral wrongness and rightness has nothing to do with what you're saying right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
I also want to talk about the dog.
Yeah, me too.
Because his I'll let you go. I've been talking for a while, but it's like, but yeah, his reaction to the dog scenario, which notice is not a fanciful thought experiment, right? I mean, this is the thing that happens, right? Was really weird, right? Like his level of confidence was really hard to match with like the actual basis for this within his view.
Yeah, maybe I might have to be reminded like what exactly, because to me it was strange, because he said something like, oh well, you know, the dog is alive just like a flower is alive, and so they have some sort of like moral like importance or something like that, because morality is grounded in life. But it's like, no, like your philosophy is egoistic. Like morality is grounded in your life, not life per se, right? So like the fact that the dog is alive doesn't matter. What matters is whether respecting the dog and not torturing it enhances your life or helps you to stay alive or makes your life more, you know, involve more flourishing or whatever. And it was particularly bizarre because he says later, after they moved on from the dog point a little bit, he says like later that, oh, the reason you should be good to others is because they can, you know, for one, it's better to live in a society where people respect like moral norms. And so you should like respect moral norms. And two, it's like they might be your friend. They might cause you some benefit down the line. They might like invent like a vaccine or something. And that's strange because it's like, well, clearly that doesn't hold for the dog, at least necessarily, right? Like a dog's not going to make a vaccine. It's not necessarily going to provide you any benefit down the line, or plausibly it's not going to. So it just seems like the rationales that he gives for why it's wrong to cause harm don't apply to the dog.
Right.
And I don't really think he ever gave an explanation for why it did. Yeah, I mean, there's like other thought experiments you can go to if you're not perturbed by like animal suffering, for instance, where it's like, you know, this is like a little bit fanciful, but like not that fanciful, I guess, where it's like people who say this like, oh, well, our reasons for other people, you can run this on like certain sorts of contractarians as well, where it's like some people will say like, well, our reasons to be good to other people are just that doing so and upholding our end of the contract makes them more likely to uphold their end, and that benefits us in a sort of roundabout way. It's like, okay, like let's say like some like rich guy and his friends want to like go to some like obscure island and like hunt down an isolated tribe and kill them. And, you know, the isolated tribe otherwise will have like no contact with like the rest of humanity, will never provide any economic benefit to anyone else, etc. Like, surely that would be wrong, even though this is a case where the people are very much isolated and capable of doing anything for you.
Yeah, totally. I mean, this, and you know, I think the animal suffering thing is a really clear case, and you're right. He never exactly explained how the dog tied in. You know, even though he was so confident that's like it's a horse that's like really seriously morally wrong, and like, look, you know, obviously, because not being a complete sociopath, I mean, that's like his instinctive moral reaction. But it's like, yeah, how do you ground that in the theory, right? Because you know, it's like his move was to say, well, it would be even wrong to just like, you know, kick the shit out of a flower for no reason because it was like a beautiful flower. And the sort of implied argument is, okay, clearly dogs have like a greater status than flowers. And so it's wrong to even, you know, like sort of wantonly destroy the flower. Therefore, it must be really wrong to the dog. And it's like, okay, that has some plausibility, but, you know, the reason why we normally think dogs have so much greater status than flowers is because we're not ethical egoists, right? I mean, like we think that, like, you know, the fact that the dog has the capacity for suffering, right, you know, gives it this like automatic claim on our moral concern. But like that can't be it, right? Because he, you know, because is like, you know, it's just because something has a capacity for suffering. I mean, why does that mean that we're going to live more flourishing lives if we don't make it suffer? I mean, like, and I understand, right, that it is important. Like, it is important to Rand as a way of avoiding like all of the like crazily obvious counterexamples to review that would be present otherwise. That there are, you know, that it's to make a distinction between living a flourishing life and like what you think is good for you, right? Like that it you know, she does make a big point of saying you could be wrong, right, about what's good for you, right? That, you know, that people that, so, you know, if you're just going around stealing from people or whatever, right, you know, that it's like that's not really a good life, even if you think it is. That the really good life is about, you know, creative and, you know, creative pursuits, that, you know, that there's this sort of like underlying almost Aristotelian notion of what it is to flourish, right? You know, that you're that it's that, you know, it's ultimately, you know, that it's about your, you know, developing your capacities and all of this stuff. Fair enough. But look, why is it that not causing a bunch of pain to a dog on that account, right? That's all about developing your capacities and living the most flourishing life, even objectively the most flourishing life for yourself that you can. Why does all that mean it's wrong to set the dog on fire, right? And like, I mean, you know, like he said, okay, it'd be wrong to like wantonly destroy the flower for no reason, but it's like, surely nobody, I mean, outside of maybe Jainism or something, right? Like nobody thinks that like it's wrong to like, you know, yank plants you find aesthetically displeasing out of your yard, right? You know, because you find it like, what if you find dogs aesthetically displeasing, right? What if you know, what if your idea of great art is dogs on fire, right? Like that's, you know, that like you actually, you know, it's like, it's very, very unclear to me how he can get around this consequence of his view.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that much about Ayn Rand's actual view. Like, so it sounds like you know a little bit, Ben, but I guess because I've been kind of wondering, like, I've been trying to think about, you know, generous ways. Like, so maybe does Ayn Rand have a view about like, you know, appreciating beauty is like part of, because, and like, I wonder if Ayn Rand has a view that like, you know, this objectivism, does it include some theory of like objective beauty or something that is like, you know, not merely some like subjective appreciation? So I don't know, like,
yeah, maybe that's how she would get out of it, that that like the dogs on fire aren't objectively beautiful.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, or that even like appreciating nature is like somehow part of a flourishing life. So if you're just like wantonly destroying it, like I don't know, that's my attempt to give like a generous, plausible take. Again, not having actually read Ayn Rand.
Yeah, I've read a bit. I think like I've read her essay Virtue of Selfishness, where she talks about a lot of this stuff. I don't really remember but yeah, I'm sure Ayn Rand.
This guy's also doing a bad job of explaining it too. Like that's the other problem, right? Like I just feel like this guy is like, he's kind of like invoking Ayn Rand's name and then like not really like fleshing it. Like I feel like not like, it doesn't even seem like he understands the nuances of the view. At least he's not doing a good job of communicating it. So
yeah, I'll buy that. Yeah, Ethan.
There was some point a minute ago that I think I lost track of. We were just talking about.
Well, I was just talking about appreciation of like.
Oh
nature.
yeah. I was like, you could say something like that, if you're an egoist where you say like, oh, well, I accept like an objective list theory of well-being, and like some of the items on the objective list are like being good to others, you know, not causing people pain, etc. And so you could try and avoid the reductios like that. I mean, one is that I think that's sort of explicitly not the Randian view, but two is like, and there's this point that Ben made earlier, which is like, there's also just this intuition that like, I think like most reasonable people will have, that like, to the extent that it's good not to torture other people, like at least part of the reason for that is because of like their intrinsic moral status, not just because like torturing them is bad for me, you know, like that is definitely not like the structure of the torturing people is bad, like intuition for most people, I don't think, is that, oh, that seems like really bad for me if I were to do that. So yeah.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, this is, and it just seems crazy to say that the people in China and India, that like if somebody's only reason for caring about them is that one of them might turn out to be, you know, like somebody like invent a vaccine or something, right? Like that was his example. It's like one, it's just plausibly not even going to be, you know, like remotely coextensive with like any normal idea of the sphere of moral concern, right? But they like, because clearly, like, look, that, you know, I mean, if you think about, yeah, like that isolated island, you know, that, you know, in Ethan's example earlier, I mean, just like, yeah, in real life, right? Think about like that island with like the tribe that's always like shooting arrows at missionaries, right? I guarantee you that nobody on that island is going to invent a vaccine that's going to benefit me, right? Like, so, you know, if I like, surely that doesn't mean we can just napalm them, and that's, you know, and that's morally unobjectionable. Like, it's just, yeah, it's really, and like, yeah, what's the dog like? If, you know, I mean, if you're allergic to dogs and, you know, et cetera, it's like, it's, you know, that doesn't, you know, that doesn't seem, yeah, but what, I mean, dog's not going to invent a vaccine. That's, you know, and the dog's not even going to provide you any joy in your life if you know, have the allergy and whatever, you can't interact with them. Like, you know, it just doesn't seem like it seems like there's no amount of being objective about what counts as a good life that's going to get you the moral obligations to the people on the Hermetic Island or the dog, unless you're just doing what Rand clearly does not want to do, and just building substantive moral obligations directly into the conception of a good life, instead of trying to derive all the moral obligations from the conception of a good life.
Yeah, no, yeah, that's definitely right. Yeah. Also, did you catch that? Did you guys catch that point where where like the guy is giving Alex O'Connor, because so, you know, we've been talking obviously about some of the reductios that Alex O'Connor gave to this guy, and then this guy's responses. But I thought it was funny when the guy tried to like counter Alex with his own sort of thought experiment, where he was like, do you think that just like being tortured all the time would be worse than like living in like pure bliss and constant virtue? And Alex was like, yeah, I think that would be worse. And he's like, well, there you go. Like, you're basically an objectivist then. Or it's like, no, like any like semi-plausible or popular moral theory is going to agree with that verdict. Like, it's not clear how that's supposed to do any work for this like Randian theory.
Yeah, I mean, that's also, I mean, I guess that's also the Sam Harris, which is actually funny because Sam Harris uses it to argue for utilitarianism, right? That, you know, we imagine the worst possible misery for everybody. That would be bad. Okay, therefore you agree that, you know, it's the morality is all about happiness and suffering, right? Yeah. And also you notice that when he was sort of painting his pictures of heaven and hell, he like built in some libertarian economics, you know?
Yeah.
It was like, oh, then, you know, everybody's happy and virtuous, whatever. Or you could be forced to do things. It's like, I don't know. I mean, if I'm imagining the world where, you know, I mean, like not even me with my views, but I mean, it's like a very universal I, right? I'm imagining a world there, you know, where like some people are starving to death because there's no welfare benefits, or one that's otherwise exactly similar, but there's like a 1% tax on everybody's income and nobody's starving to death, you know. Like I think you know, I think like nobody who hasn't been completely brainwashed by Ayn Rand, you know, would pick the first one. So like, yeah, it seems really unclear how you're going to derive anything substantive from the choice that he gave Alex, you know, without going some places that he doesn't want to go as a Randian. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive post-games on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.